And the talk I want to present today is titled Max, Expansion from a Programming Paradigm to a Distributed Lab. So, okay. So obviously programming language and software environments have been one of the vital topics in the computer music and electronic music literature. And mostly these topics have been discussed and researched in a more technical standpoint about their technical capabilities or their kind of the technical infrastructure. However, kind of my personal interest was to view it in a more broader scope. As Bruno Latour quoted, a very technical community literally has a lot of social aspects. And my personal interest in the social aspect was the knowledge production and the aesthetic implementation of these certain software environments in the computer music community. And as a case study among various computer music software environments, I have chosen MaxMSD and Pure Data, mainly because for two reasons. First of all, is AOI use software in this community, but also it is a software tool that I use most for my project. And I wanted to have more of a retrospective critique about my own practice too. So that kind of motivated myself to start this research as a case study of MaxMSP and Pure Data. I'll refer these two programs as Max, as Miller Puckett did in his paper. And as a brief introduction about Max, who may not be familiar with this, Max is a graphical programming environment for audio and visuals. It is coded by positioning rectangular objects in various locations. Each object has unique functionality and inlet-outlet numbers. And the user connect these objects with patchwords, which are like lines, which represent the flow of data and signal. The fundamental design goal of Max was to schedule real-time tasks and manage communication between them. So first, kind of the point I want to make is about the design features of Max, and I want to connect it with the notion of the open work. So the open work is a notion kind of coined by Umberto Eco in his research on poetry and kind of an open form of art. The open work can be broadly defined by a work that is in movement, a work that is not definitive in form and does not come in a closed fashion. Rather, it constitutes either to the public or the chance, and there are multiplicity of possible orders that is possible. The author or the artist offers the interpreter, the performer, and addressee as a framework for the work to be completed. According to Eco, he suggests several examples as an open works, and one of them was a composition by Stockhausen, which the performance, the instrumentalist freedom is a function of the narrative, the structure of the piece, which allows the performer to mount the sequence of musical units in the order they choose. And the specific, among the various discussion Eco proceeds in this book, the part that I want to focus was his third chapter, which he tries to talk about the relationship between information and meaning. And the information he's referring in this part is the information theory by Claude Shannon. And the part he critiques is that in information theory by Shannon, due to their more statistical approach handling on this topic, they somehow believe information and meaning of a message are equivalent. However, Eco criticizes this part, saying that information and meaning cannot be equivalent as due to the matter of communication. According to Eco, the message delivers the information, and the meaning is how the receiver perceives the information and processes them. This process or perception process involves several aspects such as natural, social, historical, and cultural background of the receiver. Now, another interesting extension of this work happened done by Alan Blackwell, where he applied this idea of open works and his critique and Eco's critique on information theory into digital contents. More specifically, Blackwell has applied this to live coding, and he talks about that the programming itself doesn't add any additional information because they're predetermined semantics, but the meaning or the aesthetics are created by the performer of their virtuosic live coding performance, and also how the audiences perceive them into the stage. And through this, he kind of argues that digital contents have the capability becoming, and end user softwares has a capability of becoming some sort of open works. And it was, excuse me. And it was interesting to observe also that some of the creators of Max had an intuition about this, even though they did not directly reference Umberto Eco. Miller Puckett wrote in his publication that artifacts of art may be owned, but digital art itself is not intrinsically ownable by anybody. David Ziccarelli also makes a more direct kind of relationship, saying constructing a system in Max is not enough, but one must still operate it to achieve its results. And these two very high level ideas related to the open work does not only contain in a more kind of high level statement, but this have been actually applied to the kind of the software architecture of Max itself to achieve being more accessible for non-programmers and also for avoiding stylistic bias. These include the graphical programming paradigm, which enables a wider accessibility, excluding linear control flow, such as loops, conditional, and subroutines to achieve simplicity, and starting with a blank page, which avoids some stylistic bias. Okay. However, this notion of open works does not only stay in the end users, but actually it kind of goes deeper and it gets applied to the system builders by providing source codes or SDK package development through C or C++. David Ziccarelli talked about this as a hierarchy of incompleteness. And I think this part of the hierarchy of incompleteness, which I'll discuss further in the later section, is the part where it is connected to this idea of a distributed lab that I have talked about in the title. Now, before I talked about how this notion of the open works get applied to a deeper lower level layer, and also how it connects to the distributed lab, I want to first talk about why we talk about labs nowadays. Because lab seems to be a term that is overused. We see labs everywhere, and especially in the world of creative computing or media studies or etc. We are living in a world where almost everything is a lab, and trying to make a distinction between what is a lab and what is not a lab seems to be almost meaningless. And this really overabundance of labs has been addressed by a recent publication by Darren Wersler, Laurie Emerson, and Jussi Parikka. And how they start this discussion also puts this into account. In their book, they say labs are discursive and relational. And to understand the lab, they suggest that a survey or distinction isn't really meaningful. And rather, they suggest a heuristic approach to analyze lab as a processual and relational approach. They named it as an extended lab model, which consists of viewing lab as a heuristic of space, technique, imaginary, people, policy and infrastructure, and apparatus. And what through these heuristic framework they want to achieve is to see how knowledge is being produced and being recognizable by a group. And they kind of critique that the importance of transfiguration and knowledge transfer had increases in the humanities of arts. The rise of the labs are currently happening. And what I want to and of course, and Max does have various elements of these type of heuristics, which in a more trivial example could be these various types of tools that provide knowledge sharing or knowledge sharing or kind of tutorials or documentation. But the more critical part I want to emphasize is, as I mentioned before, the lower level section where the system builders, where the source code or through a source code or the SDK package development. So for example, in Max, there are various packages that are created by individuals or institutes, including the Center for Research in New Music in Huddersfield also. These kind of packages or source code kind of differentials provide even a nebulous type of possibilities or even represent a certain aesthetical implementation that is often as big as Max itself, such as the Bach package family, which provides computer-aided composition in Max. Often these packages even contradicts with the original design philosophy of Max, such as the ODOT package developed from CMMAT. ODOT provides functionality to do scripting and also do subroutines, conditional, and loops, which Puckett tried to avoid because of the increasing complexity. And the more important part is that all of these objects does not have any hierarchy, because in Max, different from other object-oriented programming paradigms, there aren't any scope nor namespaces to avoid hierarchy. To add a little bit more elaboration, in most object-oriented programming language, there's this concept called scope and hierarchy. So for example, this is a reference of a documentation from the C++ language, which is an object-oriented programming paradigm language. And all of the math-related modules, such as minimum and maximum, are inside the math class. And this architecture assumes that minimum and maximum are under the umbrella of math in a conceptual perspective. However, max, since namespace and scope doesn't exist, there aren't any hierarchy between those various objects, and they can literally be mixed and matched. And also the externals developed by other peoples or institutions are hierarchically kind of equal to the original max object also. Ziccarelli also wrote this part as one of the fundamental parts of the max paradigm as followed. The abundance of objects is an additional evidence that max is more of an ecosystem than a language, because none of these hundreds of objects is technically more fundamental than any other. To return to the ecological metaphor, we can say that the design of max allows a proliferation of individual elements that never overwhelm the overall environment. Now, before I go to the next session, I do want to briefly mention that, however, these apparatus and spaces are recently more English-based, which I kind of see the shortage of the current Max community. And I just wanted to give a quick note about this before I proceed. Now, through this case study of Max, I'm not trying to say that Max is the only software among the creative coding environment that has this function, that's had this characteristics as a lab. What I want to say is this way of viewing I think this case study provides a way of viewing software as an extended lab, or as a mean or a dynamics of a knowledge production and aesthetic implementation. And I think, and I definitely believe that other software environments such as SuperCollider, Chuck, or Faust does a similar way in an extended lab model. However, the heuristics will be different. And based on this methodology, I believe we can have a more diverse and more holistic viewpoint about a technology-based music practice in a software basis. Now, after this observation, my natural interest became, so how did this came from? And this curiosity got fostered because of this interview of Miller Puckett, which he did with Darwin Gross, where he said, Max originally started from a purely computer science idea. And he said his main interest was to create a real-time scheduler. And this automatically led me to shift my research interests during the time of IRCOM during the 1980s. And I want to see how this history at that time has shaped this computer science-based idea into a more of a distributed lab and a design principle of the open works. And this part is still an ongoing process research, but I do want to share some of the anchor points that I find that are relevant and interesting. The two anchor points that I found which were important was Miller Puckett's more interpersonal interaction with Philip Himonori while his project utilizing the 4X machine. And the second part was the institutional dynamics of IRCOM at that time. During the 1980s, there was a spawn and fascination toward the 4X machine, which is the real-time digital signal processing machine at the time. Also, as Georgina Bourne really well documented and researched, there was really this notion of opaque and undocumented fragile software development process at IRCOM, which is IRCOM 2. In addition, there was this, as an IRCOM, as an institution, they had a methodology of working in the form of division between the composer and the researcher, which is still also relevant and remaining until today. And first of all, to talk about the interaction between Philip Himonori, Miller Puckett actually quoted that Philip Himonori was a kind of a unique composer in IRCOM who he interacted with, who was more autonomous than the composers he worked with before. And he was basically willing to have control over the system that he's building. Therefore, what Miller Puckett focused on when he was working with Minori was not to provide technical capabilities, but actually empower him to have more control on it. And this has led to a more cyclical, iterative design process and development that can empower Philip Minori in a higher fashion. Miller Puckett, quote unquote, says, literally, he was giving Philip a new version of Max every day for months. And I think this really kind of resonates with this concept of a lead user, usually being researched at the technology management literature. A lead user is a kind of an extreme case user where the customer or user found no choice but to invent a solution themselves to fulfill their needs. And in the technology management literature, it is often considered that if the company focuses on these few extreme cases, it's easier for them to afford a technological innovation. And I think a further research on viewing the two interactions between them as a lead user perspective can give more fruitful results in the future. And another interesting anchor I found is how Puckett got the inspiration of the very distinct semiotic difference between the end user, which is a graphical programming paradigm, and also for semiotics for the system builders, which is a strict C or C++ programming scripting. And Puckett directly referenced that the idea of dividing the source code, SDK, and an end user drastically different was a direct map of the culture at IRCOM in the 1980s. So in a more kind of a broader blueprint picture, we can kind of see during the 1980s that Puckett's very abstract and computer science-based idea for a real-time scheduler 4x has been inspired to become a more graphical programming paradigm through interaction with Minari as a lead user. This has been challenged by the very opaque and undocumented software development at IRCOM at the time, but also Puckett actually referenced the institutional structure of IRCOM, which strictly divided a researcher and a composer. And I think a more detailed research based on this blueprint will provide more connection on the historical context and the design characteristics and its characters as a distributed lab of Max in a more richer way. And I think I'm just right on time. Here are the references, and I'll open room for more questions. And thank you so much for listening.